You stopped reaching out first because every time you did, it felt like you were the only one trying to keep the connection alive. You watched conversations become shorter, invitations become rarer, and people who once promised they would always be there slowly disappear without explanation. At first you blamed yourself. You wondered if you had become too quiet, too emotional, too different, too difficult to love. Then you tried changing. You smiled when you were hurting. You made yourself available. You lowered your expectations. You became the person everyone could lean on while secretly wishing someone would notice that you were the one carrying the greatest weight. Yet somehow, the loneliness only became deeper. The room could be full of people, but your heart still felt like it was standing in an empty field. The hardest part was not being alone. The hardest part was feeling invisible while surrounded by everyone else. And perhaps what confuses you most is that you have prayed about this more than once. You have asked God why relationships seem so easy for other people while yours always seem to drift away. You have asked why every meaningful connection feels temporary. You have wondered why every season of your life seems to involve another goodbye. Sometimes, late at night, after everyone else has gone to sleep, you have whispered prayers that no one else has ever heard. God, if I am doing something wrong, please show me. If I need to change, I will. Just do not let me spend my whole life feeling like I do not belong anywhere. Those prayers were never dramatic. They were quiet, honest, exhausted. Maybe that is why they mattered so much, because they came from the deepest place inside your soul, the place where appearances no longer exist and only truth remains. Perhaps this message found you because you have been carrying a question that no one around you seems able to answer. Why does God allow someone who genuinely wants to love people to experience so much distance? Why does someone who desires meaningful friendships often walk through long seasons of isolation? Why would a loving God seem to keep certain people away from everyone else? Before you rush to answer that question, stay with it for a little longer. Resist the urge to explain your pain too quickly. Sometimes we misunderstand a season because we judge it before it has finished doing its work. A seed buried beneath the ground could easily believe it has been forgotten. It cannot see the sunlight. It cannot feel the wind. Everything around it looks dark and lifeless. Yet what appears to be abandonment is often preparation taking place where no one can see. What if your life has felt like that? What if you have mistaken hiddenness for rejection? What if the silence you fear has never meant that God walked away from you? There is something remarkable throughout Scripture. Again and again, God often prepared people in places where almost nobody noticed them. Not because people were worthless, but because the deepest work of transformation rarely happens in crowds. It happens where applause cannot distract you. It happens where identity is no longer built upon the opinions of others. It happens where faith slowly learns to breathe without constant reassurance. Think about the moments in your own life when you changed the most. They probably were not the easiest seasons. They were the moments that forced you to confront fears you had successfully hidden for years. The loneliness made you notice how much of your confidence depended on being accepted. The silence exposed how much your peace depended on hearing constant encouragement. The waiting revealed how quickly your hope could become attached to circumstances instead of to God. None of those discoveries felt pleasant, yet each one uncovered something that could never have been healed while life remained comfortable. Maybe that is why this season feels so strange. God is not only interested in changing your circumstances, He is deeply committed to transforming your heart. And transformation often feels uncomfortable before it becomes beautiful. You may have noticed that whenever you finally begin depending entirely upon someone's approval, something changes. The relationship shifts. The opportunity disappears. The conversation fades. The door closes. At first it feels cruel, but over time you begin realizing something extraordinary. Every time you tried building your identity upon something temporary, God gently refused to let it become your foundation. That does not mean every ending comes directly from God, or that every broken relationship is part of some hidden plan that you can fully understand. People have free will. Misunderstandings happen. Life is complicated. Yet even in those realities, God can faithfully shape a person who continues trusting Him. He wastes nothing that is surrendered into his hands. He is able to redeem even the chapters that you would never have chosen for yourself. Perhaps you have noticed another pattern. You often feel different from the people around you, even when they are kind. Their conversations satisfy them, but leave you feeling empty. Their priorities seem clear while yours seem deeper somehow, though you cannot always explain why. You laugh with them, but afterward there is still a quiet ache inside your spirit. You wonder whether something is wrong with you because ordinary life never seems completely enough. That feeling can become incredibly lonely. Yet sometimes it is not evidence that you are broken. Sometimes it is evidence that God is awakening a hunger that ordinary distractions cannot satisfy. A heart that longs deeply for Him often discovers that temporary things lose their ability to completely fulfill it. That realization can feel like loss before it becomes freedom. If any part of this reflects what you have been living, leave a comment saying, "I understand." Not because those words solve anything overnight, but because someone else reading them may realize they are not the only person walking through this kind of season. Sometimes healing begins when loneliness discovers it has company. One of the greatest lies discouragement whispers is that everyone else has figured life out except you. It tells you that everyone else's friendships are effortless, everyone else's faith is stronger, everyone else's purpose is clearer. But you rarely see the hidden battles people carry behind their smiles. You do not hear the prayers they whisper when nobody is listening. You do not know the nights they spend, wondering whether God still remembers them. Comparison has a way of making another person's visible moments seem larger than your invisible journey. Yet God measures differently. He sees faithfulness that nobody applauds. He notices tears that nobody else witnessed. He remembers prayers that you yourself have forgotten praying. Jesus spoke often about what the Father sees in secret. That truth matters because much of your life probably feels secret right now. Secret disappointments, secret fears, secret hopes, secret endurance. You may think your hidden life has little value because few people recognize it. Heaven measures differently. Character formed in private often becomes the strongest foundation for whatever comes later. Imagine building a house. Most people admire the walls, the windows, the roof. Very few celebrate the foundation buried beneath the earth. Yet without that invisible structure, everything eventually collapses. God frequently works like a master builder. Before He strengthens what people can see, He strengthens what they never will. That process requires patience. It requires surrender. It requires trusting Him when visible evidence seems absent. And perhaps that is where you find yourself today. Not abandoned, not forgotten, not overlooked. Simply in a season where God is doing much of His deepest work beneath the surface. There is another reason these seasons can feel so painful. Isolation often exposes every unresolved fear you have been carrying for years. Fear of being unwanted, fear of never belonging, fear that everyone eventually leaves, fear that you are somehow too much or somehow never enough. Those fears become louder whenever external distractions disappear. At first that feels unbearable, yet it also creates an opportunity. God cannot heal wounds we continue hiding from ourselves. Sometimes He lovingly allows silence, because silence removes the noise that has kept deeper healing postponed. That does not mean He enjoys your pain. Scripture consistently reveals a God who is close to the broken-hearted and compassionate toward those who suffer. His heart is not indifferent to your tears. The cross itself reminds us that God entered human suffering rather than watching it from a distance. Because of that, you never suffer alone even when it feels that way. He understands rejection. He understands betrayal. He understands being misunderstood. He understands what it means to love deeply while being rejected by many. That does not erase your pain overnight, but it transforms its meaning. Your loneliness no longer becomes evidence that God has abandoned you. Instead, it becomes a place where His presence can quietly meet you in ways that busy seasons rarely allow. Perhaps one day you will look back and realize that the relationships you desperately wanted would never have allowed you to become the person God was shaping. Perhaps you will recognize that some empty seasons protected you from depending upon people in ways that only God could ultimately fulfill. Perhaps you will see that being set apart for a time was not the same as being forgotten forever. You do not have to understand every reason today. Faith rarely begins with complete explanations. It begins by trusting the character of God, even while many questions remain unanswered. And maybe that is the invitation waiting before you now. Not to celebrate loneliness, not to pretend rejection does not hurt, not to deny the tears you have cried, but to slowly believe that the God who began a good work in you has not stopped working simply because the season became quiet. Before this message continues, hold on to one thought. What feels like distance today may not be the final story. There may be purposes forming beneath the surface that your present eyes cannot yet recognize. And when you begin to see them, you may discover that the very season you once begged God to remove became the season that taught you to know Him more deeply than you ever imagined possible. There comes a moment when the silence no longer feels temporary. At first you tell yourself that next week will be different, that someone will call, that a friendship will grow deeper, that the heaviness will lift. Then weeks become months, and months become years, and you begin to wonder if this is simply who you are now. You stop expecting invitations because disappointment hurts less when you expect nothing at all. You become skilled at saying you are fine because explaining the truth feels exhausting. People see your independence and admire it, never realizing it was born out of necessity rather than preference. They call you strong because you rarely complain, but strength can become a lonely title when it hides a heart that longs to be understood. There are days when you walk through crowded places and quietly ask yourself why it seems so natural for everyone else to connect, while you continue feeling like an observer watching life happen around you. You smile at strangers, complete your responsibilities, answer messages, attend gatherings when you have to, but inside there is still the same unanswered question. God, why does my life keep returning to this place? Why does it always seem as though I am standing just outside the circle? It is tempting during moments like these to believe that isolation itself is the purpose, that you were created only to endure loneliness. But that is not the picture Scripture paints. God Himself declared that it was not good for man to be alone. Throughout the Bible we see fellowship, encouragement, community, and love celebrated as gifts. So if relationships are good, why would some seasons feel almost empty of them? The answer may not be that God desires your isolation forever. It may be that He is protecting something inside you while it is still growing. Think about how fragile new roots are. Before a tree reaches toward the sky, it stretches downward into places nobody celebrates. If someone became impatient and pulled the tree upward to measure its growth, they would destroy the very thing they hope to accelerate. What appears slow is often essential. The unseen determines the strength of everything that eventually becomes visible. Your spiritual life often follows the same pattern. You naturally want visible confirmation that God is working. You want changed circumstances, restored relationships, open doors, clear direction. God certainly can provide those things, but sometimes He first develops roots that can support the weight of what you are praying to receive. Without those roots, the blessing itself could become the very thing that weakens your soul. Imagine receiving influence before humility has matured. Imagine receiving deep relationships before healing from old wounds. Imagine receiving constant affirmation before learning that your worth already rests securely in God. The gifts themselves are beautiful, but if the foundation beneath them remains unstable, they can quietly become substitutes for the one who gave them. This is why seasons of hiddenness can feel so confusing. God may be answering prayers in ways that look completely different from what you expected. Perhaps you asked Him to use your life, and He began by teaching you dependence instead of visibility. Perhaps you asked Him to strengthen your faith, and He answered by allowing situations where faith became your only source of stability. Perhaps you prayed to become more like Christ, and then found yourself walking roads that required forgiveness, patience, endurance, and trust. None of those answers feel exciting while you are living them. They often feel like the opposite of progress. Yet spiritual growth rarely announces itself with dramatic moments. More often it happens quietly, almost unnoticed, until one day you realize you respond differently than you once did. There was a time when rejection completely defined your value. Now it still hurts, but it no longer determines who you are. There was a time when silence immediately convinced you that God had forgotten you. Now you still ask questions, but somewhere beneath them remains a steady confidence that he has not abandoned his work. There was a time when another closed door destroyed your hope. Now disappointment still brings tears, but hope survives because it has become anchored somewhere deeper than circumstances. That is growth, not the absence of struggle, but the presence of faith within it. Consider the life of Joseph. He experienced betrayal by those closest to him, false accusations, years of waiting, forgotten promises, and long stretches where it would have been easy to conclude that God had abandoned the dream planted in his heart. Yet every difficult chapter developed qualities that could never have been formed inside comfort alone. His integrity was tested when nobody rewarded it. His patience matured when no timeline made sense. His compassion deepened because he understood suffering personally. By the time the opportunity finally arrived, he had become someone capable of carrying responsibility without being consumed by bitterness. The years that seemed wasted were actually preparing him for the years everyone remembers. Many people desire the public chapter while resisting the private process that makes it possible. Your own life may feel similar in ways you have never recognized. Perhaps nobody knows the quiet victories taking place inside you. Nobody applauds the temptations you resisted. Nobody notices the prayers you continued praying after hope seemed almost gone. Nobody celebrates the mornings you chose faith, despite waking up discouraged. Heaven notices every one of those moments. God measures faithfulness long before the world measures success. This changes the question entirely. Instead of asking only why God keeps you away from certain people, perhaps another question begins to emerge. What is He building within you while you are here? That question does not erase loneliness, but it transforms the way you carry it. Instead of viewing this season only as something to survive, you begin asking how God might be shaping your character through it. Maybe He is teaching you compassion, because people who have suffered quietly often recognize hidden pain in others. Maybe He is teaching discernment, because not every relationship deserves equal access to your heart. Maybe He is teaching contentment, so that future blessings become gifts rather than necessities for your identity. Maybe He is simply teaching you to recognize His voice above every other voice competing for your attention. If this part of the message resonates with your own journey, share in the comments one lesson God has been teaching you during your waiting. Someone else may read your experience and realize that their difficult season is not meaningless after all. One of the unexpected dangers of constant companionship is that noise can become an escape from deeper questions. We stay busy enough to avoid confronting the fears we carry. We fill every quiet moment with conversation, entertainment, or distraction because silence forces us to meet ourselves honestly. Yet many of God's greatest invitations happen in those quiet places. Not because He only speaks when we are alone, but because we are finally still enough to listen. Elijah expected God in dramatic displays of power, yet discovered Him in a gentle whisper. That whisper required attention. It required slowing down. It required a heart willing to hear what could easily be missed amid louder voices. Your own life may contain whispers that busyness would have drowned out completely. Gentle reminders that you are loved before you achieve anything. Quiet convictions inviting you to forgive someone who never apologized. Small moments of peace appearing without logical explanation. Unexpected strength arriving on days when you thought you had nothing left to give. These are not always dramatic miracles. Often they are evidence that God has remained close, even while your circumstances remain difficult. There is another painful reality many people never discuss. Sometimes God allows distance from certain relationships, because those relationships have become places where your identity slowly disappears. You begin shaping yourself around keeping everyone happy. You silence convictions to avoid conflict. You shrink your personality so others remain comfortable. Little by little, you forget who God created you to become because you have become consumed with becoming acceptable to everyone else. The loneliness that follows separation can feel devastating, yet it also creates room for rediscovering yourself before God. You begin asking what truly matters instead of merely asking what everyone expects from you. You begin making decisions based upon conviction rather than approval. You begin realizing that peace is often found not in pleasing every person, but in walking faithfully with the one whose opinion never changes according to popularity. This process is rarely comfortable. Some days it feels as though your entire life is being rearranged. Old expectations no longer fit. Familiar routines lose their satisfaction. Conversations that once energized you now leave you strangely empty. It can feel as though you no longer belong in places where you once felt completely at home. Rather than assuming something is wrong, consider the possibility that growth naturally changes what satisfies your soul. Children eventually outgrow clothes they once loved. That does not mean the clothes were bad. It simply means growth has occurred. The same can happen spiritually. Certain environments, conversations, or priorities no longer nourish the person you are becoming. This does not make you better than anyone else. It simply reminds you that growth often requires change, and change frequently feels like loss before it reveals new life. Even now, as you listen, there may still be unanswered questions inside your heart. You may still wonder when meaningful relationships will come, when the waiting will end, or why this particular path became yours. Those questions are understandable. God never asks you to pretend they do not exist. Throughout Scripture, we find faithful people bringing honest questions before Him. The difference is that they learned to place those questions into trustworthy hands. They discovered that while they could not always understand His ways, they could gradually learn His character. And His character remained faithful through every season. Hold on to that truth as this journey continues, because there is still a deeper realization ahead, one that has the power to completely reshape the way you interpret every lonely chapter you have ever lived. One day you may find yourself looking back at this season with tears in your eyes, not because you wish you could live it again, but because you finally understand what you could never see while you were inside it. Right now, your story probably feels unfinished. The unanswered prayers still ache. The empty chair still reminds you of the people who walked away. The quiet weekends still seem longer than they should. The dreams you once carried with excitement may now feel fragile because disappointment has visited them so many times. If someone asked you today whether you trust God, you would probably answer yes. But deep inside, there is another question that you have almost been afraid to say aloud. Why would a loving father allow one of his children to feel so alone for so long? That question deserves compassion, not shame. Faith has never meant pretending difficult questions do not exist. Throughout the pages of Scripture, faithful men and women poured out confusion, grief, disappointment, and longing before God. They did not lose their faith because they had questions. Instead, they brought their questions to the one they believed could hold them. Perhaps that is where your heart is today. You are not asking because you want to walk away from God. You are asking because you desperately want to understand Him. Yet sometimes understanding does not arrive through explanations. Sometimes it arrives through transformation. There are things your mind could never fully comprehend until your heart has lived through them. Think about how often Jesus withdrew from the crowds. Thousands sought Him, yet He repeatedly stepped away into quiet places to pray. He valued people deeply, but He refused to let constant access replace intimate communion with the Father. That rhythm reveals something profound. Solitude is not the same as abandonment. There is a kind of loneliness that wounds the soul, but there is also a kind of sacred quiet where God gently reshapes it. The enemy would love for you to confuse those two experiences. He whispers that because you are alone, you must be forgotten. Because people misunderstood you, God must have overlooked you. Because the season has lasted longer than expected, hope itself must have expired. Yet the voice of God consistently speaks differently. He reminds you that His presence is not measured by the number of people standing beside you. He reminds you that your worth has never depended upon popularity. He reminds you that the chapters where nobody applauds are often the chapters where eternity is quietly being written into your character. Consider how many decisions you have made during this lonely season that nobody will ever know about. The mornings you chose prayer instead of despair. The evenings you decided not to become bitter even though bitterness would have felt justified. The moments you forgave people who never admitted they hurt you. The times you resisted the temptation to compromise your convictions simply to avoid feeling isolated. Those moments may appear insignificant to the world, but heaven sees them differently. They are evidence that something stronger than circumstance has been growing inside you. Character is rarely built through comfort alone. It is forged when obedience becomes costly. There is another truth that often remains hidden until much later. Sometimes God keeps certain people away, not because they are bad people, but because He knows how easily your heart can attach itself to human approval. Imagine if every lonely moment had immediately been filled by another relationship. Would you have learned to seek God's voice with the same persistence? Would you have discovered that His peace could sustain you when every earthly source of comfort disappeared? Would you have realized that His love remains constant even when human affection changes without warning? These are not easy lessons, but they become priceless foundations. A house standing through the fiercest storm is not admired because the storm was pleasant. It is admired because the foundation proved trustworthy. God is far more interested in building that foundation within you than in creating a life that appears impressive from the outside. That perspective changes the meaning of delay. Delay is not always denial. Waiting is not always punishment. Hiddenness is not always rejection. Sometimes they are classrooms where eternity quietly prepares the soul for responsibilities that temporary comfort never could. You may not yet know what God intends to do through your life. None of us can claim certainty about His specific plans, but Scripture consistently reveals that He values faithfulness before visibility, humility before influence, and character before recognition. Those priorities often seem backward in a world that celebrates immediate success and constant attention. Yet God's work has never depended upon the speed of human expectations. It unfolds according to His wisdom, not our timelines. Perhaps the greatest miracle taking place in your life right now is not one that other people could ever photograph or celebrate. Perhaps the miracle is that despite every disappointment, your heart still turns toward God. Despite every unanswered question, you still whisper prayers. Despite every goodbye, you still hope. That resilience is not weakness. It is evidence of grace quietly sustaining you day after day. Left to ourselves, discouragement would eventually consume us. Yet somehow you are still here. Somehow you are still listening. Somehow a small flame continues burning inside you, even after winds tried repeatedly to extinguish it. Do not underestimate that flame. Throughout Scripture, God often delights in preserving what appears small until the appointed time for growth arrives. There may also be another reason this season has mattered more than you realize. Your future compassion is being shaped by your present suffering. People who have never walked through loneliness can certainly offer kindness, but those who have lived it carry a different kind of understanding. They notice the quiet person everyone else overlooks. They recognize the smile hiding exhaustion. They understand that someone can appear successful while privately wondering whether anyone truly knows them. Your pain is not something to glorify, but it can become something God redeems. The comfort you have received from Him, even in small ways, becomes comfort you can one day extend to someone else. Suddenly, the lonely years become more than personal survival. They become preparation for loving others with unusual depth and gentleness. Before closing this part of the journey, pause for a moment and think about the person you were before this season began. Perhaps you were more dependent upon other people's opinions. Perhaps disappointment quickly shattered your peace. Perhaps you measured your value by how included you felt. Now compare that person with who you are becoming. The road has been painful, but you have also grown in ways that comfort alone could never have produced. Your prayers have become more honest. Your faith has become quieter but deeper. Your compassion has expanded. Your priorities have shifted. You no longer chase every opportunity to be noticed because you have begun discovering the quiet security that comes from being known by God. That transformation is not complete. None of us reach perfection in this life, but it is real and it matters. If this message has reminded you that your season is not meaningless, share in the comments something God has been teaching you through your waiting, or simply write, "God is still with me." Your words may become the encouragement another weary heart needs today. As you leave this message, do not carry the burden of believing you must suddenly understand every chapter of your life. Faith is not the certainty that every question has been answered. Faith is the quiet confidence that the one writing your story remains good, even when the next page has not yet been revealed. There will still be difficult days. There will still be moments when loneliness returns unexpectedly. There will still be prayers that seem to linger without immediate answers. But let those moments remind you of this truth instead of the old lie. You are not forgotten. You are not invisible. You are not overlooked. Your value has never been determined by the number of people surrounding you, and God's love has never been measured by the ease of your circumstances. Even now, while much remains unseen, He continues shaping your heart with patience, faithfulness, and purpose. The season that convinced you everyone had left may one day become the very season that taught you the unshakable reality that God never did. And when you finally look back across the entire journey, you may discover that what once felt like being kept away from everyone was, in many quiet and mysterious ways, an invitation to draw closer to the one who had been walking beside you all along, faithfully turning even your deepest loneliness into a place where hope, endurance, and lasting peace could take root.